Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring how to turn numbers into knowledge.
Ooh, that's a good one.
It is, right? So we're going to be taking a deep dive into Jonathan Koomey's book, Turning Numbers into Knowledge. And I think by the end of this, we'll all feel a little more confident and comfortable working with data.
Yeah, like we can all be data detectives.
Exactly. And one of the things that I really appreciated about Koomey's approach is this emphasis on not being intimidated by data.
Yeah.
He has a whole chapter called Don't Be Intimidated. And I think it's something that we can all relate to, right? Like sometimes you see all those numbers and charts and you're just like,
Oh my gosh.
yeah, I can't even deal with this.
Yeah, it can feel really overwhelming.
Totally. And I love that he addresses that right off the bat, because I think that fear of data can really prevent us from actually engaging with it and learning from it.
Yeah, it's almost like if you go into it feeling intimidated, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're putting up a barrier before you even start.
Yep.
And so I think that's such an important starting point.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of understanding information and data, Koomey introduces this really interesting concept called the cycle of action. And it's this idea of how we use information to actually make decisions and take action in the real world.
Okay.
So before we get into all the nitty-gritty details of it, can you just give me the big picture overview of how this cycle of action works?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to think about it is imagine you're facing a really big decision, something that's keeping you up at night.
Yeah.
The cycle of action kind of helps you break down that problem into these manageable steps.
Okay.
So you start by getting really clear on what you're trying to achieve, what's your goal?
Yeah.
What are you aiming for?
Right.
Then you start gathering all the information you can, all the data that might be relevant to that goal.
Okay, so it's we're gathering clues for our big decision.
Exactly. Then the next step is where the magic happens. You start processing that information, you analyze it, you try to make sense of it.
So we're sifting through the data.
Exactly. And based on that analysis, you start to form an intention, you decide on a course of action.
Okay, so that's where we make the choice.
Right. And then you take action, you put your decision into practice.
We make the move.
You got it, but it doesn't stop there. The cycle continues with evaluating the outcome.
Okay.
Did your action actually achieve what you wanted it to achieve?
So we're checking to see if our decision worked.
Yeah, and then you take what you learned and apply it to the next decision. You're constantly refining and improving your approach.
So it's like a feedback loop. We're constantly learning and adjusting.
Exactly. But here's where things get a little more tricky. Koomey points out that there are all these unknown and unknowable factors, assumptions, values that can kind of sneak into each stage of the cycle.
Oh, right. So it's not as straightforward as it might seem.
Right. It's messy and it's human. And he brings up this really fascinating example, the changing trend of stock analyst recommendations. So back in 1983, sell recommendations made up about 25% of the suggestions analysts were giving.
Okay.
But by 1998, those sell recommendations had practically disappeared.
Wow. So what happened? Why the sudden shift?
Well, part of it was the bull market. Everyone was feeling optimistic. Buy recommendations seemed like a safe bet.
Right.
But there was also this more subtle factor at play, pressure from the companies being analyzed.
Oh, so there were outside influences at work.
Yeah, analysts who gave sell recommendations sometimes found themselves excluded from company briefings.
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah, and they might even lose out on lucrative stock offerings.
Wow. So their access to information and even their potential profits were being influenced by the opinions they were putting out there.
It's a really powerful example of how external factors can shape how data is interpreted and used.
Yeah, that's a little unsettling to think about.
It is, and it reminds me of another point. Koomey makes this idea of puncturing the bubble.
Okay, I'm intrigued what's puncturing the bubble all about.
Well, it refers to this idea that information is often filtered and sanitized before it reaches those key decision makers.
Right.
Imagine a CEO who's surrounded by yes men.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to bring them bad news or challenge their assumptions.
But they're living in a bubble.
Exactly. And Koomey uses this example of Robert Reich, who was the U.S. Secretary of Labor.
Okay.
And Reich's staff, they were really careful about what information they let him see.
They were controlling his reality.
In a way, yeah, they created this bubble around him that limited his access to potentially crucial information.
So even someone in a powerful position like the Secretary of Labor can be limited by the information they have access to.
That's right. And I think it's something we should all be mindful of. Are we getting caught in our own information bubbles? Are we actively seeking out diverse perspectives?
Yeah, that's a really important question, especially in today's world, where it's so easy to get stuck in those echo chambers and filter bubbles.
Yeah.
And this leads us to another really crucial skill that Koomey emphasizes, this idea of critical thinking.
Oh, yeah, critical thinking is essential.
Yeah, it's like having this mental toolkit for navigating this world of information.
Absolutely. It's about carefully dissecting information, identifying biases, looking for flaws in reasoning.
Right.
And it's especially important nowadays when we're just bombarded with information from all sides.
So how does Koomey actually define critical thinking, and why is it so important when we're trying to turn numbers into knowledge?
He sees it as this essential skill for evaluating arguments and claims, like separating fact from fiction.
Okay.
It's about moving beyond just passively accepting information and really actively engaging with it, questioning it, testing it.
So we're not just taking things at face value.
Exactly. We're digging deeper.
And he even provides like a step-by-step process for critical thinking.
He does. It's like a roadmap for becoming a more discerning consumer of information.
I love that, a roadmap. Okay, so what are some of the key steps involved in this critical thinking roadmap?
Well, it starts with identifying the main conclusion and the supporting premises of an argument.
Okay.
You're breaking it down into its core components.
So it's like we're trying to figure out what the argument is really saying and what evidence it's using.
Exactly. And then you analyze the logical structure of the argument, like how do those premises connect to the conclusion? Are there any gaps in the reasoning?
So we're checking to see if the argument makes sense.
Right. And then you assess the relevance and adequacy of those premises. Are they strong enough to support the conclusion, or are they based on shaky evidence?
Okay, so we're making sure the evidence is actually credible.
Exactly. And here's where things get really interesting. You start looking for missing arguments or comparisons. Is there something that's being left out that might change our perspective?
So we're making sure we're seeing the full picture.
Right. And finally, you check for fallacies or errors in reasoning. Are there any logical traps or manipulations being used?
Oh, so we're being on the lookout for any tricks.
Exactly.
Wow, this critical thinking process is thorough.
It is. It's a valuable skill to have.
Not just for analyzing data, but for life in general.
Absolutely. And that's really what this whole deep dive is about. We're giving you the tools to be a more critical and discerning consumer of information.
Yeah, to be a true data detective.
Exactly. And to understand how numbers can be used to reveal the truth.
Yes, and to not obscure it. Which brings us to another really important point, that Koomey makes numbers aren't everything.
Yeah, that's a good one.
He dedicates a whole chapter to this idea, cautioning us against thinking that every decision can be boiled down to a simple equation.
Right, because there's so much more to life than just numbers.
Exactly. There are those human emotions, values, experiences that can't always be quantified.
And Koomey actually makes a distinction between things that are difficult to measure, maybe because of time or resource constraints, and things that are inherently unmeasurable, like those subjective experiences you mentioned.
Right. So it's not that we should dismiss numbers altogether, but we need to be aware of their limitations.
Absolutely. It's about using them wisely and understanding what they can and cannot tell us.
And finding that balance between the quantitative and the qualitative.
Exactly. And that leads us to another important caveat that Koomey highlights: all numbers are not created equal.
Oh, that's a good one.
He cautions against mistaking historical correlations for immutable laws.
Oh, interesting.
Just because something has been true in the past doesn't mean it will always be true in the future.
Right. We can't assume that trends will continue indefinitely.
He uses this example of the perceived link between energy use and GDP.
Okay.
For decades after World War II, there was this strong correlation between the two, which led some people to believe that it was this unbreakable law.
Oh, so they thought it was a given.
Yeah, but then from 1973 to 1986, U.S. energy consumption actually remained flat while GDP grew significantly.
So they decoupled.
Yeah, exactly. That law was broken.
So it's a reminder that the world is constantly changing and we need to adapt our thinking accordingly.
Absolutely. We need to be wary of drawing sweeping conclusions based on limited data.
And of assuming that patterns will hold true forever.
Exactly. And this ties into another crucial piece of advice: question authority.
Ooh, that's a tough one sometimes.
It is, but it's so important.
Especially when it comes from those seemingly credible sources.
Right. Koomey gives us two main reasons why we should always question authority.
Okay, I'm listening.
First, even experts can be wrong.
Oh, yeah. History is full of examples of that.
Exactly. And second, salespeople and marketers often exploit our deference to authority.
Oh, yeah, to get us to buy their product.
Exactly. They'll use endorsements from experts to try to convince us to do things that might not actually be in our best interest.
Right. So it's about thinking for ourselves and not just blindly accepting what we're told.
And he uses this great example of Fred Smith, the founder of Federal Express.
Okay.
His idea for overnight delivery was initially dismissed as like totally infeasible by a Yale professor.
Wow, so even the experts at Yale can get it wrong.
Exactly. But Smith believed in his vision. He challenged that conventional wisdom, and he ended up revolutionizing the shipping industry.
It's inspiring. It's like a reminder that sometimes the best ideas come from challenging the status quo.
Absolutely. And from having the courage to ask tough questions.
And could trust our own instincts.
And to be informed, to gather evidence and build a strong case for what we believe.
Which brings us to another incredibly important point. Don't believe everything you read.
Especially in this age of instant information sharing.
Right, with social media and the internet, it's like misinformation can spread like wildfire.
Koomey highlights this example of a Software Publishers Association report.
Okay.
They put out this report claiming that sales of Mac software were declining,
Okay.
and they based this conclusion on preliminary data.
Oh.
But when the final data came in, it showed significant growth in Mac software sales.
So they jumped to conclusions.
He did,
Yeah.
and those conclusions were widely disseminated, potentially misleading a lot of people.
That's a little scary.
It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of preliminary data and the importance of always digging deeper to get the full story.
Yeah, we can't just accept things at face value.
Exactly. We need to be savvy data detectives.
So what are some strategies for ensuring that we're not being misled by misinformation or incomplete data?
Well, one thing that Koomey really stresses is this idea of going back to the source material.
Okay, so like getting to the root of the data.
Exactly. Like when you encounter survey data, for example.
Yeah.
Don't just read the summary or the headlines. Go and read the actual questionnaire that they used.
Oh, wow. So really get into the weeds.
Yeah, and figure out who conducted the survey and what their potential biases might be.
Right, because everyone has an agenda.
And then dig into how they selected their sample and the time frame of the survey. All of those factors can influence the results.
So it's like we need to be our own fact checkers.
Exactly. And the same critical eye should be applied to reading tables and graphs.
Okay.
Don't just glance at the numbers and move on. Take your time. Scrutinize those footnotes. Look for any ambiguous definitions or terms.
Meticulous.
Exactly. Check to see if the numbers internally add up and make sense. And most importantly, be on the lookout for what Koomey calls cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance. I'm not familiar with that term.
It's that feeling you get when something just doesn't feel right, when the data clashes with your existing knowledge or intuition.
Oh, like when something seems off.
Exactly. And Koomey encourages us to lean into that discomfort.
Instead of ignoring it.
Yeah, use it as a springboard for deeper understanding.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, why am I feeling this disconnect? What am I missing?
So it's not about dismissing data that challenges our assumptions, but using it as a cue to dig deeper.
You got it. Those moments of friction can lead to some of the most powerful insights.
I like that. And this is especially important when we're dealing with forecasts, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially in unpredictable areas like the stock market.
Yeah, because it can be so tempting to put all our faith in those predictions.
But as Koomey points out, even the experts can get it spectacularly wrong. He shares this example in the book where these prominent financial analysts made these wildly inaccurate predictions about the stock market.
And the surprising thing is, even after those missteps, they remained in their positions.
It seems like we often give forecasts more weight than they deserve, especially when they come from respected sources.
I think that's true. So Koomey's advice is to focus on the reasoning behind the forecast, not just the prediction itself.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what assumptions are they making? Are there any potential biases in their methodology? What other factors might influence the outcome?
So we're taking those forecasts with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Exactly, and not blindly trusting predictions just because they come from someone with a fancy title.
So far, we've been talking about how to assess other people's analysis. But what about when we want to create our own analysis and present our findings to others?
That's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, no, I do. Where do we even begin?
Well, Koomey offers a lot of great advice in the book about creating compelling analyses and presentations, and one of the things he really emphasizes is the power of storytelling.
Storytelling with data.
Yeah, he even connects it to scenario analysis, which is this structured way to explore potential futures and their implications.
So even when we're dealing with numbers, it's still important to craft a compelling narrative.
Absolutely. It's about making the data come alive, showing how it relates to real-world experiences and decisions.
Right, because data without context can be meaningless.
Exactly. And Koomey stresses the importance of focusing on the key insights and their relevance to your audience.
So avoid getting bogged down in the technical detail.
Exactly. Keep it simple, keep it relevant, keep it engaging.
I like that. But even with a good story, sometimes I feel overwhelmed by the sheer amount of data. Where do I even start?
That's where Koomey's advice to dig into the numbers comes in.
Okay.
He encourages us to get our hands dirty with the raw data, not to rely on summaries or prepackaged analyses.
So we're going straight to the source.
Exactly. He gives this great example where he analyzed raw data on steel production, population, and GNP to understand long-term trends in U.S. manufacturing.
Wow.
And he did this by normalizing the data to a common baseline year, which allowed him to see how these factors had changed relative to each other over time.
So he's taking ownership of the data and exploring it from different angles.
You got it. And speaking of exploring data from different angles, Koomey also provides a lot of practical guidance on creating compelling visuals.
Graphs and figures.
Exactly, because visuals can really make data come alive.
But creating visuals is a skill in itself. There are so many choices. Bar charts, line graphs, pie charts. How do you know which one is the right one?
Koomey really emphasizes choosing the right type of graph to tell the story of your data.
Okay.
He talks about using clear labels and annotations, avoiding distortions that might mislead your audience,
Right.
and using a consistent scale and units so you're making honest comparisons.
So it's about making sure your visuals are not only visually appealing, but also clear and accurate.
You nailed it, and the same principles apply to creating tables.
Okay.
Koomey stresses clear column headings, row labels, consistent formatting, and units, and of course, properly sourcing your data.
Transparency is key.
Absolutely. But even with compelling visuals and tables, I think a lot of people struggle with presenting data effectively, especially in oral presentations.
Yeah, it's easy to overload people with information.
Koomey's advice is to keep it simple.
Okay, less is more.
Exactly. Use just a few key numbers, present them visually, and focus on the story and the insights, not just the raw data.
So highlight the key takeaways.
Exactly. Think about what you want your audience to walk away with.
And make sure your presentation reflects that.
You got it. And speaking of making information accessible, Koomey dedicates a whole chapter to this idea of using the internet effectively.
Yeah, that's interesting. The internet could be such a double-edged sword when it comes to information. How does Koomey suggest we use it effectively?
He's a big believer in the internet's potential for democratizing knowledge and connecting people.
I can see that.
He talks about using it for research, obviously, but also for sharing data sets and collaborating with others.
It's about breaking down those silos and creating a more open and transparent research environment.
Exactly. And he even touches upon this concept of the semantic web.
Okay, I've heard that term, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Well, imagine a web where all data is not only accessible, but also understandable by machines. That's the basic idea behind the semantic web. It's this vision of a web where data is seamlessly linked and easily analyzed, which could lead to some amazing breakthroughs in knowledge discovery.
So it's like taking the internet to the next level.
Exactly. It would make it so much easier to find the information we need when we need it.
That would be incredible.
Yeah.
And speaking of sharing information, Koomey ends the book with this really powerful chapter called Share and Share Alike.
He's a huge proponent of open data and collaboration.
It's this idea that we can achieve so much more when we work together.
Exactly. He talks about the emergence of data sharing platforms and the growth of these open data communities.
It's really inspiring to see that movement gaining momentum.
It's a recognition that knowledge is most valuable when it's shared.
And that really captures the spirit of Koomey's book, Turning Numbers into Knowledge. It's not just about crunching numbers for the sake of it, but about using them to understand the world around us and to make a positive impact.
Absolutely. It's about empowering ourselves and others to become more informed and engaged citizens.
Especially in a world that's becoming increasingly data-driven.
This ability to turn numbers into knowledge is more crucial than ever.
Yeah, it really is. And it ties into something else we were discussing earlier, that whole idea of questioning authority.
Right, even when it seems like they know what they're talking about.
Exactly. Koomey points out that even experts can get things wrong, and sometimes those mistakes can have a ripple effect.
It makes you think twice about blindly trusting anyone.
It really does, and I think it's our responsibility as critical thinkers to approach information with a healthy dose of skepticism.
So we're not just taking things at face value. Right, we're asking questions, we're digging deeper, and we're considering different perspectives.
We're being detectives.
Exactly. And one of the most valuable tools in our detective toolkit is this idea of making consistent comparisons.
So using real-world examples to illustrate our points.
Yeah, because sometimes abstract concepts can be hard to grasp, but when you ground them in concrete examples, they suddenly become much clearer.
Koomey gives that great example of Honda's fuel-efficient Civic VX.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It really challenged those claims by U.S. automakers, who insisted that improving fuel efficiency was just too expensive.
The Civic VX proved them wrong.
Exactly. It was a real-world demonstration of what was possible.
It's a reminder that actions speak louder than words.
And that applies to data analysis, too.
Yeah.
We need to bring those numbers to life.
To show people what those numbers actually mean in a way that they can connect with.
So it's not just about presenting a bunch of dry statistics.
Right, it's about telling a story with those numbers.
But even with a good story, sometimes I feel overwhelmed by the sheer amount of data.
I hear you, it can be a lot to process.
Where do we even start?
Koomey's advice is to dig into the numbers.
Okay.
He encourages us to get our hands dirty with the raw data, not to just rely on summaries or prepackaged analyses created by others.
So we're becoming more active participants in the process.
Exactly. We're taking ownership of the data and exploring it from different angles.
He gives that fascinating example where he analyzes raw data on steel production population and GNP.
To understand long-term trends in U.S. manufacturing.
Wow.
And he does this by normalizing the data to a common baseline year, which allows him to see how these factors have changed relative to each other over time.
It's like he's creating a level playing field for the data.
Yeah. And speaking of exploring data from different angles, Koomey also provides a lot of practical advice on creating compelling visuals.
Ah, yes, those all-important graphs and figures.
Because a good visual can really make data come alive.
But creating visuals can be tricky. There are so many different types of graphs. How do you know which one to use?
Koomey's advice is to choose the right type of graph to tell the story of your data.
Okay, so the graph should serve the data.
Exactly. He talks about using clear labels and annotations, avoiding distortions that might mislead your audience, and using a consistent scale and units.
It's about making sure your visuals are not only visually appealing, but also accurate and ethical.
Absolutely. And the same principles apply when creating tables.
So clarity and transparency are key.
You got it. And then even with compelling visuals and tables, I think a lot of people struggle with presenting data effectively, especially in oral presentations.
Oh yeah, it's so easy to overload people with information.
It really is. Koomey's advice is to keep it simple.
Okay, less is more.
Exactly. Use just a few key numbers, present them visually, and focus on the story and the insights, not just the raw data.
So don't get lost in the weeds.
Right. Think about what you want your audience to walk away with and structure your presentation accordingly.
And speaking of making information accessible, Koomey dedicates a whole chapter to using the internet effectively.
It's interesting because the internet can be such a double-edged sword when it comes to information.
It can be both a blessing and a curse.
Right. So how do we navigate this vast sea of information? How do we separate the wheat from the chaff?
What's Koomey's take on this?
Well, he's a big proponent of the internet's potential for connecting people and democratizing knowledge.
I can see that.
He encourages us to use it not just for research, but also for sharing data sets and collaborating with others.
So we're breaking down those barriers between individuals and institutions.
Exactly. And he even touches on this concept of the semantic web.
I've heard of that, but I'll admit I'm not entirely sure what it means.
It's basically this vision of a web where data is not only accessible, but also understandable by machines. So it's a web where data is seamlessly linked and easily analyzed, which could lead to some really amazing breakthroughs in knowledge discovery.
It's like the next generation of the internet.
Exactly. And it would make it so much easier for us to find the information we need when we need it.
That's exciting to think about. And speaking of sharing information, Koomey ends the book with a powerful chapter called Share and Share Alike.
Yeah, he's a huge advocate for open data and collaboration.
It's this idea that we can achieve so much more when we pool our knowledge and resources.
Absolutely. He talks about the emergence of data sharing platforms and the growth of these open data communities.
It's really inspiring to see this movement gaining momentum.
It is. It's a recognition that knowledge is most valuable when it's shared.
And that really captures the spirit of Koomey's book, Turning Numbers into Knowledge. It's not just about crunching numbers for the sake of it, but about using them to understand the world around us and to make a positive impact.
Absolutely. It's about empowering ourselves and others to become more informed and engaged citizens in this increasingly data-driven world.
And I think that's a perfect place to pause for now. So we've covered a lot of ground in our exploration of Koomey's book, Turning Numbers into Knowledge.
We have, from overcoming data intimidation to the power of critical thinking to the importance of storytelling.
And I think one of the most valuable takeaways for me has been this idea of embracing cognitive dissonance.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
You know, that feeling of discomfort when the data challenges our assumptions.
It's so easy to just brush those moments aside, especially if the data confirms what we already believe.
But Koomey's encouraging us to lean into those moments of friction, to use them as a springboard for deeper understanding.
It's like a reminder that learning and growth often happen outside of our comfort zones.
Exactly. And that ties in nicely with another key theme from the book, this idea of questioning authority.
Even when those authorities are experts in their fields.
Because, as we've seen, even the most respected experts can get things wrong.
And those mistakes can sometimes have far-reaching consequences.
So it's up to us to be critical thinkers, to not just blindly accept everything we're told.
We need to be willing to ask those tough questions, to seek out multiple perspectives, to be aware of potential biases.
It's like we're all detectives in a way, trying to piece together the puzzle of what's really going on.
And one of the most powerful tools in our detective toolkit is this idea of making consistent comparisons.
Ah, yes, using real-world examples and anecdotes to illustrate our points.
Because stories have this incredible power to connect with people on an emotional level.
They can make abstract concepts feel more tangible and relevant.
Koomey gives that great example of Honda's fuel-efficient Civic VX.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
It completely debunked the claims of those U.S. automakers who insisted that improving fuel efficiency was just too costly.
The Civic VX proved that it was possible.
And it became this symbol of innovation, a real-world example of how things could be different.
It's a reminder that actions often speak louder than words.
And that applies to data analysis, too. We need to bring those numbers to life.
To show people what those numbers actually mean in a way that they can connect with.
So it's not just about presenting a bunch of dry statistics.
We need to find a way to weave those numbers into a narrative that resonates with people.
And that narrative should be actionable.
It should give people insights that they can use to make better decisions in their own lives.
It's about empowering people with knowledge, not just overwhelming them with information.
And that brings us back to one of Koomey's core messages, the importance of sharing knowledge.
He envisions a world where data is openly accessible, where people collaborate to analyze it, and where that knowledge is used for the greater good.
It's a powerful vision, a vision of a world where knowledge is democratized.
And where everyone has the tools and the opportunity to turn numbers into knowledge and to use that knowledge to make a positive impact.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Jonathan Koomey's Turning Numbers into Knowledge, we hope you're feeling inspired to embrace your inner data detective.
Don't be intimidated by data. Explore it with curiosity and a critical eye, and use it to make more informed decisions in your own life.
And remember, knowledge is most powerful when it's shared. So go out there, engage in thoughtful conversations about data, and let's work together to build a world where numbers are used to illuminate, not to obscure.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed it. And if you're interested in learning more, we highly recommend checking out Jonathan Koomey's book, Turning Numbers into Knowledge. It's a treasure trove of insights that will stay with you long after you finish reading it.